Now, I'm taking for granted that you could all build this interface that's shown on the screen right now. All right? That you know what the labels are, what the text boxes are, what the buttons are. I don't care if you say, yeah, I don't like the way you make those read-only ones a different color, then keep them gray. I don't really care. I just do it so you can tell, so that it stands out. That's all. And so I can tell. So I'm also taking for granted, as we look at this, that you can set tab order. So again, I would expect on this problem, the tab order would be here, then 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 here. And if you set tab order, for everything, I'd probably then go to I would probably next do my read-only text boxes, and then I come through and just do the labels. Does that make sense to everyone? The tab order means literally, if you ran the program and you kept hitting your tab key, what fields would it go to? All right. I'm also assuming that in here, if I told you to set the calculate button as the accept button and the clear button as the cancel button, you know how to do that. All right. The test that you take on Monday is even simpler than this in that there's only one button. It's more or less a calculate button. So I want you to set the accept button to that, but there's nothing to set the cancel button to. Does that make sense? Also, I expect that you can set the start position to center screen. Does that make sense? All right. As far as naming the controls, again, I gave you the way that I name them. They're not maybe the most fantastic names, but they're all functional. All right. So as we look at everything else that's in here, because we're just going to jump right into the code in a minute, you have to validate the first name and the last name. So in other words, if they're equal to double quote, and if I didn't do it, shame on me, but I'm going to make sure I change it if I have to, because you should trim that too, so that it won't hold it. It won't consider you hitting the space bar to be a valid name. All right, but if that happens, you'll do a throw statement, and you will throw an argument exception. In that catch for the argument exception, what should you do? Well, there's nothing to clear because it's already empty, right? So all you should do basically is just set the focus there and return for the first name and the last name. Does that make sense to everyone? Because you're going to see it in just a minute. All right. So the other two, the miles driven and the gallons used, both of those have two types of checks. First, you want to check to make sure it's not empty or non-numeric. Technically, empty is non-numeric. That makes sense? All right. Second, you want to see if it's within range. So you should have created 4 constants for this program, like a min miles that you set to 1, a max miles you set to 1,000, a min gallons, I think I call mine min gals, that you set to 1, and a max gallons or max gals that you set to 100. Does that make sense? So if you put in something non-numeric, you should throw an argument exception. If you have something that's out of range, it should be an argument out of range exception for both of those. Does what's going on here make sense? So we will take a look at the code in just a moment. Put each validation routine into its own method. Having global variables, having global constants are okay. I would recommend that when you take your test, because again, I'm doing a little rewrite to try to make the words better, but I'm giving the same test Mr. Gudmested is giving. And if he doesn't say in there, or I don't say, use only local variables, darn, I'd make everything global because it's a lot less to worry about as far as passing things. If you're told to make variables local, then make your variables local. Does that make sense? Just follow the instructions. All right. Put all the work for the totals into either one method or into separate methods, whatever you want. And again, remember, we didn't go over it yesterday. We're doing it today. All right. Questions on any of those instructions? All right. So then I'm going to go right to the code. And again, you've got the hard copies of the code. All right. And I'm going to tell you right now, just so you know, I don't typically do what Mr. Corrigan does, in that I might occasionally, like during a test, I might walk around just to see how people are doing. But I find it to be intrusive when I walk around because people are always of the mindset, he's watching me. What am I doing wrong? Type of an idea. All right. And I've already been kind of ridiculed by my peers saying I should do more than I do. Now, if you want that, let me know. I can walk around. But I figure if you have problems, you're either going to raise your hand or you're going to come up and ask me. Now, maybe that's not a right thing to assume, but it's what I do assume. All right. So I'm assuming as we go through this that it's making sense to you. In the past, when I gave a pretest like this, what I would do was I would not only give you a hard copy, but I would give you the electronic copy. Then a couple times during the test, what I watched people do was they tried taking my electronic copy and just changing the name of the variables, and now it's their test. And you know what? I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, but they weren't really learning anything. That's the problem. All right? It's like the people, I've told you this before, the people who've said to me, I got an A in your class and I never even opened the book. Well, that's a problem on my part, not on yours, because you should be looking through the book because I meant to augment the stuff in the book. I can't go over all, however hundreds of pages there are in this book. All right? Okay, so using system and using systems form, I called mine miles per gallon. So we come in here. Here are my 4 program constants. I made them doubles. So min miles, min gals, max gals. Hopefully looking at that, there's nothing in there that doesn't make sense. All right. Then I've got a first name and a last name. In fact, I didn't even need these. You can see that they're gray. I'm not even using them. So I could have done it without them. But I've got my miles, my gallons, my miles per gallon. Those, hopefully, just by their name, should make sense to you, what they're doing. This is my total number of miles per gallon checks that I do. This is my low and that's my high. You'll notice that I set my low to negative 1,001. I'm sorry, to 1,001. I can be assured if I put that I drove 1,000 miles and I only used 1 gallon, it would give me 1,000 miles, correct? I can be assured no matter what I put in there for the first one, it's going to replace the current value of low MPG with whatever one I do first. I could have just left it blank, but you don't want to leave that at 0 because then it's going to stay at 0, and that's what a lot of people do. All right. Then the second one, I made -1, so that'll be replaced. So I can be assured based on how I initialize those 2 variables that the first time I do a miles per gallon check, no matter what it is, that first one will become both my low MPG and my high MPG. Does that make sense to everyone? All right. I tried to put a lot of documentation in here. So if you had some questions as to what was going on, you could hopefully look at the documentation. So the calculate, as it says there, this method runs when the calculate button is clicked. It calls methods to validate first name, called validate first name, last name to validate the last name, miles driven to validate the miles driven, and gallons used to validate the gallons used. If all of those pass, we know that we've got valid data. So we can figure out the MPG and update our counters accordingly. Does that make sense? And since I'm not doing anything special with these two, I tell you what, I'm just going to comment these 2 lines out because I'm not using them. Technically, I should remove them. And again, you can always do that and go back and take a look at your code. And if you see something is in gray, all right, up here where you're defining your variables, they're not being used. All right, so you say, well, you're not using it here either. Yes, I am. It's right there. Now, again, this is how I code and how I'm showing you to code. I am by no means saying this is the only way of doing this. So if you come up with what you consider to be a better way of doing it, and you want to do that for your assignments and your test, then do that. All right, the bottom line is, again, I'm looking for the final output. Was it correct? Not so much how you got there. But I will look at it, so if you didn't do it that way, I'll look at it. All right? So, just keep going. Just so you know, I could have even shortened this. Right here. Look on the screen if you would. I could have just said there, bool keep going equals. I could have done this, and right away, like that. It's just cutting a little bit of code off. All right. I'm going to leave it the way it is, but either way works. How's that? All right. If this is true, then I know validate first name worked. If this is false, I know validate first name didn't work. Does that make sense to everyone? If it doesn't work, I'm just returning. If it does work, then I know I've got a valid first name, so I'm going to validate my last name. All right? So just follow that for just a second. So let's look at validate first name. Once I find it. There it is. All right. Now, it looks like in here I am using it, so I was wrong. So I will take those two lines I commented out and I will uncomment them. All right. Now, this is not real big as far as size goes. In an ideal world, you want to set your methods up so you can look at them on one screen. You know, I've had people who've done this, and they've said, you know, they've made them as small as you could possibly make them, like a 2-point font. And I can read it all on one screen. Well, yeah, you can see it all on one screen. You can't read it on one screen. All right. But if you look in here, when I do cut this down, it is pretty much, at least, on one screen. And I think you can read that. Even if you can't from the back, you've got the code. But let's just look because we can see everything. So you'll notice this is a try catch. So I'm saying if the first name is blank, then you're going to throw an argument exception. That will force that code for the argument exception to be caught. Now, if I don't have a catch in there for argument exception, if I don't have a catch in there, this routine is being called from the calculate button. All right? If I do not put that catch in, then the system jumps up and it says, oh, is it in the calculate button someplace? And it's not in there either. So it goes back up and it says, oh, is what called calculate? Nothing. So basically it would choke right there and the program would fail. Does that make sense? All right. What we're saying here is if we did throw an argument exception, this is what we're doing. Now, the funny thing is I didn't need this line. Why didn't I need that line that's in blue? Why don't I need that line? What's the error right above it say? It's already blank. So I'm resetting a blank field. So that was kind of dumb. But one thing that you should put in on yours, and that I didn't, is we should have said right here, dot trim. Should have done that. Everybody hear what I just said? I just added this. Even if you've got a pen or pencil, you really should add that onto yours. Because otherwise, if I hit the space bar, it's going to see that there's something in there, and it'll consider that to be a valid name. No, that's not a valid name. Putting dot trim will remove any leading or trailing spaces. So if I hit space, space, Jeff, space, space, it would remove all the blank spaces before Jeff and all the blank spaces after Jeff. But if I put Jeff space Paul, it would not remove the space in between Jeff and Paul. All right. So again, this is an example of using a try-catch block, and if the data does not meet our criteria, throwing an exception. So I'm asking the question in front of you right now. Are there any questions on anything that's going on here? You will be expected to throw exceptions and be able to handle them accordingly. All right. There are 3 problems on the test. One of the problems on the test asks you to write a program that demonstrates some different exceptions. All right. And the other one, or either, I think the other 2, both say, you know, it'll ask, for example, like for numeric data. And if you don't put anything in, or you put in something non-numeric, you'll catch it. We'll look at that one in a minute. All right. Now, if you look here, I'm just going to show you this because the last name is really, it's identical to the first name, except instead of checking the first name, you're checking the last name. Does that make sense to everybody? And again, I should have come in here and said dot trim. You really should do that. Okay? That's just adding one more check in here to try to make sure that the user can't put garbage in. When I say garbage in this case, I mean just hitting the space bar. And I've said this before. I know the gentleman here on the left hear it, but you guys may or may not have. One of the reasons the trim function was created was it used to be that people would fill out forms, an internet form or whatever, and they'd say all these fields were required, but people wouldn't want to put stuff in there. So they just hit the space bar once or twice. And there was no trim function, so it would literally put a space or more in for that field into a database. All right. Questions on validating the first name or validating the last name? Any questions? All right, then I'm going to jump back up here. So again, validate the first name. If it was okay, validate the last name. If it was not okay, return. So this is going to be the return from validating the last name. If it returned true, all right, call validate miles driven. If it returned false, call return. You're done. Return just means return. You're finished with that routine. All right, we're going to look now then at the validate miles driven. All right, so let's jump down to that. Now, what I wanted you to see in here, and you can see this in blue, all right? I couldn't remember how to do this. I wanted to be able to go through an entire string and see if any part of it was non-numeric. All right, so I still should have come in here, same thing, dot trim, still should have done that. All right, so if this is the case here, it was empty. Does that make sense? It was empty. If in here, if anything that's in here gets caught, it's something non-numeric. So I might have put hello. Hello wouldn't be empty, but hello is not numeric. What that does, and don't worry if you don't understand that in there, I literally grabbed it from the URL I'm showing you. That goes through and it checks each character at a time. And if the character is a number, it returns true. If the character is not a number, it returns false. Does that make sense? All right. So if it's not a digit, that this right here is the same thing as saying if char dot is digit C equal false. All right, that's a shortcut. Then we're throwing an argument exception. So this will catch, all right, catches blank input. This one that's here, this one catches non-numeric input. Questions? Because the other one is basically, the other routine is basically the same thing, except instead of testing miles driven, you're testing gallons used. All right? So if we get down to here, if we get down to right here, it's valid. In that, it's a valid number. All right? So if we get down to here, input was numeric. All right? We don't know if it's valid numeric, but we know that it's numeric. So this is our range checking. Does that make sense to everyone? And a lot of code that's out there, a lot of application code is written in this way. So this says, okay, now we've got a number for miles, but if that number is less than our minimum or greater than our maximum, notice now we're throwing a different kind of exception. Argument out of range. So that should say miles driven must be numeric. Notice this should say non-numeric where the previous one said what are we doing here? Argument out of range. Oh, so here we're throwing an argument exception. Oh, there, we're catching it. Okay, so this says non-numeric, but I'm not, what am I not doing in here? I'm not catching the other exception, am I? See that? I think I should have in here I'm going to replicate this right here. All right. So I've got two of them in here now. Argument exception, but I also want argument out of range exception. All right. And I have to change the name, out of range exception. All right. Now, let's see what I've got here. So this is out of range exception. All right, so I'm calling here print message box. It says it doesn't like it. Well, this should say out of range, less than 1 or greater than 1,000. All right, so still doesn't like something here, and it's telling me string. Okay, string. Cannot use local variables or local function print message box declared in a top level statement in this context. All right, so it doesn't want me to jump out of here to be able to call this. All right, not sure why, because it took it down here earlier. This was not an error. So I'm going to look through it, see if I can quickly figure out what the problem is. We could just put our message box right in here. Right? Hopefully you agree with that. I could just come in here and do this. So I could come in here and just type in message box dot show. Okay, it's got to be a little h. And then come in here, and as we did before, now I can come in and I can add my message box buttons dot OK and my message box icon dot error. Now that I should have no mistakes after that. Do you see the difference? It doesn't like the fact that I'm jumping out of here to jump down and do this. I don't know what the problem is. I guess I'd have to look through it to see what the problem is. All right. So that's that catch. Well, here's part of the problem. That curly brace for the try should be there. Nope. That's for the whole thing. So that should be down here. Okay. All right. I can run this off again if you want another copy. It's no big thing. It's a good teaching moment because I screwed up. Now, look at these two exceptions that are in here. Please look at these exceptions. I'm gonna fix this right now. All right, and this first one was non-numeric, and the second one was, that first one was non-numeric, this one is out of range. And I'd like to say, hey, I did this on purpose so I could teach you something, but I'm actually glad this happened. Let me just tell you why. Because this exception is more specific than this exception. Does that make sense to you? Because argument out of range exception is a type of argument exception. So you have to make the more specific one first before the less specific one. Now, it's telling me it doesn't like something here, and that should be AE. There. Now, when I ran this, I guess I didn't notice it, and that's why I shouldn't write code late at night, but I was getting the same error for both. All right? And now I won't be. I'll be getting two different errors, and that's good. Like I said, I'll run off a copy of this, so don't worry about it. And then we'll have to do the same thing in here for the other one. All right. So this is going to have to, again, validate just like this one does. Now, I do want to run through this first, so let's look at this. Then we'll take a break. All right, so this is validating the miles driven. So if it was empty, we're throwing an argument exception. Why? Because the argument exception is the one that says you entered something in here that's non-numeric. If we get down to here, I'm sorry, this one is empty. This one is non-numeric. But if we get down to here, we put a number in. But we could have put in there negative 57, which is an illegal number for this program. So this is our range checking. So if it's either empty or non-numeric, we throw an argument exception. If it's out of range, we throw an argument out of range exception. I got a question for you. Feel free to guess if you don't know. What if there was no argument out of range exception? What if we wanted to throw one, but there wasn't one? Any idea what we could do? We could write our own. You can write your own exceptions. I looked in here, I literally got online to check this, and it said there were about 310 exceptions that already exist in here. But like, for example, if you were, there's no exception, there's no C# exception for miles gallons, or miles driven, or for gallons used. There's nothing like that. So I picked one that I thought would make sense for it. Okay? So if we get down to here, and if that's true, now we're throwing that exception. So the out of range is going to say miles driven out of range and give us an out of range heading. If it's empty or non-numeric, it's going to say, for the argument exception, it's not going to say out of range. It will because I copied it. It's going to say here, non-numeric. If you're putting your own messages in there, always put in messages that should make sense to the end user. Does that make sense? All right. So it is 9:05. Let's take a break. After the break, I'm going to fix this other one. And we'll go over that. And after we do that, then I'll go over with you calculating the miles per gallon, updating the totals. Everything's screwed up because the other stuff is screwed up. Well, those errors are going to go away in just a minute. All right, so let's take a break. It is 9:05. Let's come back, please, at 9:20. Something's screwed up with this program, and it might be one of those things I probably should have walked out during the break, but I didn't. Sometimes the best thing in the world that you can do for yourself is, if something isn't making sense, is to just get up, walk around a little bit, and come back. All right. So right now, the program handles the miles driven just fine. But for the gallons used, even if I put in a valid value, it's not accepting it. And I'm looking, I didn't think I messed up anything in my code, but I might have. So the miles driven now has been changed to this. Again, as we saw before, inside of a try, okay, right here, if there's blank input, throw an argument exception. If we get down to here, there's something in there, but this will check for non-numeric. It's the same thing as before. Throw an argument, throw an argument. If we get down to here, we've got a value. It was numeric, so we do the conversion. We know that'll work and we won't get any error message. All right. So then we do the range checking. That all works just fine. And I tried to replicate and do the same kind of thing down below. So here's the catch. I should say that first. So here's the catch. Argument out of range, and that's an out of range miles driven, as we said before. All right. So it clears it out after giving a message box. It sets the focus, and it returns false because it was bad. Here, if it's our argument exception, meaning it was empty or non-numeric, we put that it was non-numeric, we put in that message, we clear it out, we set the focus, and we return false. Now that should make sense to all of you in here because we've done this before. All right? But what I said here was, if I get down here and this check doesn't fail, I don't hit the if, I should just come back in and return true. Does that make sense to everyone? I don't need an else there. All right. I could, but even with an else, my one below didn't work. That one works just fine. So notice if I come in here now and run this, I'm just going to run through the whole gamut here. It says blank first name cannot be blank. That's my message. And then I print out the system's message. Valid does not fall within the expected range. That's from that message thing from it itself. Okay, so I'll put in my first name. Now blank last name, the same kind of thing. Last name cannot be blank. That's all fine. So far, so good. All right. Non-numeric miles driven. Miles driven non-numeric, that's good. Again, it says miles driven non-numeric, that's good. If I put in something out of range, it shouldn't be saying non-numeric, but it is. It says miles driven non-numeric. And that's saying out of range. Oh, you know why? Can somebody take a guess and tell me? Notice with a -9, it's saying non-numeric. Anybody have any idea why it's saying non-numeric instead of out of range? Yes.
Because it's got the negative in it?
It's yes, but it's more than that. Remember that thing up above where we did that char.isDigit? All right. The problem with doing the char.isDigit, the way I'm doing it, is it will only hold whole numbers.
The dash.
Yes, the dash is looked at as being a non-digit. Guess what? It also, right in there, it's only expecting whole numbers. So if I put in a decimal point, it's again going to fail. So the check I made was not a good check. It works, but it was not a good check.
Something wrong with the by part?
No. What I'm telling you is, if I come in here and I put in 123.8, this is also going to fail. It says non-numeric, and it's the point, the decimal point that it doesn't like, because I'm checking for isDigit. Now, could I do it the other way? Could I check for all this stuff? Yes, but it's more work than you think. All right, because I'd also have to write another thing, and I would have to check for a decimal, but I would only have to make sure there's only one decimal. And if I check for a negative sign, I have to make sure there's only one, and it has to be before any number. You see what I'm saying? All right, so I'm just going to leave it where all input has to be whole numbers. So if I put that in, now it's saying non-numeric gallons used. Okay, that's what it should say. It should again say non-numeric gallons used, and it is. But if I put in now -9, it again says non-numeric, okay. And if I put in a number too big, it says, I put a debug in there, but it says out of range. That's good. That's all doing it the way it should. But if I put in 10, that's valid, isn't it? It comes back and it gives me that debug, but it still says out of range. And I want to figure out right now, before I give you another hard copy of this, what's wrong with that? Because there's an error in here in its current form. All right, so let's step through this and see if we can figure out what the error is. So it's in here, and I checked everywhere I've changed it from text box miles driven to text box gallon used. So that's blank input, throw an argument exception. That's non-numeric input, throw an argument exception, same thing. That's taking gallons, converting it to a double, all right? And I think what the error might be in here, I hate doing this, but where I'm converting this, what I should do is convert this to an int. Here, and where's the other one? Come on, where are you? Here. Now, in order to do that, to make this run the way that it should run, I'm going to go back and change all of these that were doubles, the miles, etc. I'm going to change all these to ints. So I'm going to have to make some other changes as the program goes. And this will have to change to just 0 here and here. And these constants will also have to change. So min miles will be, I could probably end up keeping that a double, but I'm going to make that an int. I'm going to make all 4 of these ints. Now that'll mean that when I'm putting in input that I can't put a decimal place. All right, I'd say, you say, well, that stinks. I'd say, you know what, I agree with you. All right, that fixed those. All right. Now I still want down here, I still want my miles per gallon. I want that to be a double. So I'm going to have to do a cast for that. All right. And I still want my low and my high MPG to be double. So those don't have to change. All right. I shouldn't have to change anything that's in here. And that should be a 2int 32, not the 2int. That should fix that. All right, so there's miles driven. And that'll have to be a 32 as well for gallons used. Now, I don't know if that fixed my problem or not. We're going to see right now. I put in this debug right here where I'm just printing out the value of min gals, to make sure everything was being set correctly. So I'm going to run this. See how it's still saying out of range? It shouldn't be saying that. And there's something wrong in here, but I'm trying to figure it out. So I'm asking for your help. So I'm going to get rid of this message box that's in here. Do you ever have anybody ask you or think about this or see this where somebody says, what do you want on your tombstone? You know what I'm talking about? All right. I've changed mine over the years. Mine used to be, well, he tried hard. Now it's going to be the answers in the code because the answer's in here someplace. All right. So gallons converting. If it's less than min gallons, which should be 1, or it's greater than max gallons, which should be 100. So min gals is 1, max gals is 100. So that changes or check is correct. All right. So if it's out of range, it should be throwing this. Otherwise, it should be returning true. It's not returning true. It's coming down and it's coming in here and it's catching this even if I put in something valid. Do you understand what I'm saying? There is an error in this code. And I'm saying to you, if you see it, please tell me so we can all figure out what the problem is.
Go to line 208.
All right.
Change miles to...
Oh, there it is. Thank you. That's gallons. Thank you. Again, love to say, hey, I did that to see if people were paying attention. Well, then I'd have to include myself in that list. All right. Now, with that said, I could change all those back again to doubles. Did you hear me? Except I'd still have the same thing with a decimal place, all right, and with a negative number. So I'm just going to leave them as ints. Thank you, Aaron. So let's see now if that fixed it. And it does. All right. If I come in here, I'm not going to clear the name. I'm just going to clear these values. So I'm going to put in a new low. So this should go from 34 to 22. It does. I'm going to put in a new high. This should go from 34 to 55. And it does. So now everything is working. All right. Good. So let's take a look at the entire program then from there on. So we've talked about all this, so I just want to go down. Calculate MPGs is pretty simple. It's miles divided by gallons, right? Now, when you look at this, it is doing it to F2, but if it's always going to give me a whole number the way it is. What am I saying? Well, would you agree that if I put in something like this, I don't know, 267, and if I put in here 8, that shouldn't come out evenly. Would you agree with that? But if I do this and calculate, notice what it says, 33.00. And the reason that it says that is that I should be casting one of these to a double, or both. It doesn't matter. So I'll just cast them both. Double and double. Now if I run that again, and I put in, I think I said 89, and we'll put it in 8, for example. Now I get the 0.13. See that? All right, clear, exit, boom. So what am I doing? I'm calculating the miles per gallon. I'm throwing it into its text box. I'm adding 1 here to my total MPGs. I didn't want to do it earlier because it could have been invalid. I know now that it's valid. And I'm updating the text box that holds my total MPGs. Does that make sense to everyone? All right. Then finally, for updating my totals, I think the other day somebody here had asked about this as far as lowest and highest type of things. So what am I doing? I'm saying, hey, if my current miles per gallon is less than my current low miles per gallon, it becomes my new low, and I replace what's in the text box. If my current miles per gallon is higher than my current high miles per gallon, it becomes the new high miles per gallon, and I put it in the text box. Does that make sense? So to my knowledge, this program now works and works correctly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk over by you, and I'd appreciate it if you take the piece of garbage that I gave you originally for this program and throw it in the garbage. And I will print out a copy of this. Now, is there anybody who doesn't want a copy? All right, you don't want one. Okay, that's fine. Then I'll print out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them. I appreciate that. But if you would throw out that one because it's garbage. Again, I'll try not to write code late at night. It's not just that. I'm writing code while watching television. So, never a good thing. And hopefully, even through my screw up, you got something out of that. All right, so the last couple hours of class, the last 2 hours are lab. This weekend, if you have not turned in any homework, let's just say Gabriel here hasn't turned in anything. Turn it in if you've got it done. I'll still give you partial credit for chapters 1 through 3. We did those as a class. You should be able to turn those in. 4 and 5 were due last week, but since I didn't grade them yet, I'll take them through today. I'm going to grade them tomorrow. All right, and 6 and 7 are supposed to be due today. Does everybody get that? Everybody understand that? All right, I'm hoping by the time you come in here on Monday, I'll have all that graded and your grades will be updated inside Rankin.
So that's homework 6, 7?
Yes. Or labs, whatever one it is. You know what I'm saying? All right.
I think a few things like off the semester at the beginning, you said the homework.
Yeah, but rather than doing those labs and stuff, you know, that extra exercises, I've been doing problems in class for you, and I've been doing, you know, those extra exercises that PDF you've got. Just forget that even exists. Just do all the ones. I think they're the labs. All right. All right. Let's see. Thank you for seeing that, Aaron, because I was just looking at it too much and looked right through that. All right.